think we have reached critical mass. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, depending on where you're based. My name is Mareike Ohlberg. I'm a senior fellow in the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, based at the Berlin office. And on behalf of the GMF Berlin office and the Asia program, I would like to welcome you to this book discussion on Elbridge Colby's book, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. We'll discuss the implications of China's rise for the US, obviously what could or should be the US defense strategy, and what does this mean for Europe and other partners and allies of the US. Now, before we get started and before I introduce our panelists today, just a quick reminder, we are recording this webinar and it will be put on our YouTube channel. So just so that you are aware, this is a public webinar, not Chatham House rule, not off the record. I have the pleasure to welcome three very distinguished panelists. First, of course, there's Elbridge Colby, the co-founder and principal of the Maritime Initiative, a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the US for an era of sustained great power competition. He's the author of the book we're discussing today. He was also from 2018 to 2019 director of the defense program at the Center for New American Security. And before that, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018, where he also served as the lead official in the development and rollout of the department's planning guidance, the National Defense Strategy of 2018. Second, I have the pleasure of today moderating my own boss. I would like to welcome Bonnie Glaser. She's the director of the Asia program at GMF, as most of you will know. She was previously senior advisor for Asia and the director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's also a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, and a senior associate with the Pacific Forum. And as you all know, for more than 3 decades, she has worked on the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and US politics. So US policies. So welcome, Bonnie. And last but certainly not least, I am pleased to welcome Veerle Nouwens, a senior research fellow at the International Security Studies Department of the Royal United Service Institute, where she focuses on the geopolitical relations in the Asia-Pacific region. Prior to joining them, Veerle worked at the European External Action Service at the delegation of the European Union to Singapore at the political press and information section. And she also has some experience at the European Commission, at the Embassy of the Netherlands, and in part at the United Nations. So welcome everybody to this panel. We'll start off with a brief introduction of the book itself. I will then ask our two other by Elbridge Colby. I will then ask our two other panelists to comment, to chip in with their own comments. But if in the meantime you already have a question that you would like to ask, please feel free to leave your question in the Q&A box. There should be a Q&A box where you can type in your question, and then once we get to the Q&A round, we will try to cover as many of your questions as possible. But for now, let's get started. So Bridge, could you start us off with a quick introduction to your book? What are your main arguments, your main takeaways, and why should we care? Over to you, Bridge.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mareike, and thanks to GMF and Bonnie for the invitation hosting this, and thanks to Veerle for participating. I will say, without exaggeration, you can check my work on this. I say it regularly that our relationship, the U.S. relationship with Germany, is of unique importance. I think I'm got a piece coming out in the German press, and my argument, I think the fate of Europe in a lot of ways is in Germany's hands. And I think that sounds sort of counterintuitive probably to a German audience, but I think my book in a sense it explains why I think that. And I was joking with somebody on an Italian event the other day, and they were saying maybe they'll get a translation, and we were talking about my difficulties in having a German translation, but I'd say Germany is the country that actually really should be grappling with these arguments, whether it's in my book or another form, because they are profound if indirect. And the basic idea is that, you know, we are no longer in the period of unipolarity, the period following the collapse of the Soviet Union, or in the kind of high German form that Thomas Bagger put at the end of history. You know, hat tip to Francis Fukuyama. History has returned, great power rivalry has returned. And in the context of great power rivalry, the United States is still, you know, eminently powerful, but is only about a fifth or a quarter of global power. And, you know, there are a range of threats that the United States faces in the international system. But the fundamental fact or assumption that I proceed from is that we don't have enough power just to kind of smother all of these potential threats, as we basically did in the 25 years or so following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in that context, we need to rethink from first principles what it is that our overall strategy should be, but in particular in my book, what our defense strategy should be. And my view is that defense strategy is something that you want to be marginal and something you don't have to think about, but you have to think about it a lot in order to make sure that it's like that. It's not something you can take for granted. If you don't get it right, nothing else is likely to matter as much. So in that context, and of course, I'm looking at this from an American perspective, but hopefully in a kind of an enlightened way, you know, that's sort of positive sum wherever possible. I say that the core American interest in the world, to use a Chinese term, is that no state or entity, but practically speaking, a state, dominate one of the really key market areas of the world. And if we look at it in that way, Asia is by far the most important market area. It's going to be roughly 50% or more of global GDP, and that share is growing over time. And by far the most significant other actor in the international system is China, which is now, you know, roughly, at least in PPP terms, an economy the same size as our own and growing faster. We'll see over time, but, you know, is going to be, I think of us, you know, there's 2 Jupiters in the solar system now, and they exert gravitational force accordingly. So the core foreign policy interest of the United States must be to deny China regional hegemony over Asia, which I believe is actually a relatively modest assessment of their goals. Actually, I think I'm often criticized by people who think my assessment of China's goals is actually lower than they might be. So I don't know. Bonnie is far better equipped than I am to talk about what the Chinese are pursuing. But that I think is a reasonable kind of approximation, and certainly their behavior suggested, I think, in recent years. So if that's the case, how do we do that? Well, we can't do it enough. We can't do it on our own for power reasons and resolve, et cetera. And so we need to work with a coalition. And I think of this as an anti-hegemonic coalition in Asia, composed of those countries that also don't want the region to be dominated by Asia. And that's largely going to be Asian countries like Japan, India, Australia, of course, the Quad, but also other mechanisms, Taiwan itself, hopefully South Korea over time, maybe Vietnam, et cetera. We'll see. It's still forming. That's all well and good. And in fact, we can see that happening. That the anti-hegemonic coalition is already forming. That started several years ago, and it's continuing. And the Biden administration deserves credit on things like AUKUS and so forth in the Quad. But that's the good news. The bad news is China can also see that. And my argument is that China, we cannot presume that China will be passive in the face of this forming anti-hegemonic coalition. That China, if it's seeking regional hegemony, we should assume that it will be willing to press forward in trying to attain its goals, which would be, you know, of immense significance for the American people. And I'm happy to talk about why that would be. In this context, I think what we can see already is that China is seeking to use its economic leverage from Belt and Road and just normal trading. I mean, China, if you've seen that very interesting graph, is now, you know, the central trading entrepot for many more countries than the United States at this point. So it has enormous economic leverage. But I think it's finding that the economic leverage it does enjoy is insufficient to get countries to give up the things that it would ask for its pursuit of regional hegemony. And the response of Australia is very illuminating here. And Australia is very dependent on exports to China. So my concern is that China will find the economic leverage, as we have, insufficient to achieve very ambitious goals, and will turn to the military instrument. And in this context, China has developed an extraordinarily powerful military. And it's not only a defensive military, it's now a power projection military as well, and increasingly so. They're looking for a base on the Atlantic coast of Africa, apparently, according to the Biden administration. So in this context, what is their strategy? And my view is that, when we're thinking about our defense strategy, we need to prepare for the other side's best strategy. We cannot know with confidence what exactly they will do, but if we're prepared for their best strategy, then we will be more secure. And in this context, my argument is that China's best strategy, and this is kind of a geopolitical strategy ultimately, is what I think of as the focused and sequential strategy, which is to attempt to collapse this forming anti-hegemonic coalition through a series of short, sharp wars, basically. Well, they could be short, but relatively smaller wars than, say, a total war that, like Hitler style, where you essentially assemble all of your potential opponents against you at the same time. That's foolish, costly, and very risky, and I don't think the Chinese are foolish. So instead, what you can do is you can go after this anti-hegemonic coalition, its vulnerable parts, especially those parts that are connected to the United States, which I think of as playing a critical role in this coalition as the cornerstone balancer, because only we are strong enough to directly take on the Chinese. No country can prudently take on China without some degree of backing from us. But if China can sort of zap or laser a couple of members of that anti-hegemonic coalition that are connected to the United States, then it can cause a run on the bank of our credibility, of the belief in our firmness and our capability. And the coalition will collapse because countries will have the incentive to cut a deal while they still can, rather than be punished alone. So this is the scenario that we need to prepare for. And this is a demanding scenario. So what our military needs to be able to do is defend exposed Asian allies, practically speaking, and I include Taiwan within that effectively, from a defense planning point of view, not necessarily from a political, formal point of view, but from a defense planning point of view. I include Taiwan within the perimeter. We need to be able to defend Taiwan, and by extension, other allies, well enough that they can keep holding on. They'll stay within that coalition. And that is a demanding standard, but that is a standard of denial. It's basically, if we can deny China's most effective means of coercion against those allies, then we will succeed. The problem is that China is very strong. It's very focused. It has the advantage of geography. It has the advantage of catch-up. It has the advantage of its labor costs being lower. And the reality is that we're behind. And here's where it becomes relevant for Germany in particular, is we are behind, according to the Pentagon, in how we would perform in a fight over Taiwan. And Taiwan will not be the end. It's not my view that China would not stop with Taiwan. It would not seek to probably annex other countries like the Philippines, but it would seek to exert a decisive military level of coercion to disaffiliate those countries from the American-led coalition. And that could happen rather quickly, actually. So we are behind. As the 2018 National Defense Strategy suggested, we've already moved to what's called a one-war military, which is that basically the military should focus on being able to win against China before doing other things. What we're being told is that we're not in a good situation there. So we don't have enough military power to cover the whole world. Ergo, we have to take it from other areas and theaters. And of course, that's trades within our own defense structure, say the Army potentially, although that's very difficult, but also other theaters and activities, certainly the Middle East, of course, but also Europe. And so the reality is that my view, as I wrote with Oriana Mastro the other day in the Wall Street Journal, is that we should not be putting more forces into Europe, because we are already behind, and we are falling farther behind on Asia, which is the central theater, and we cannot afford to be doing that. So that's unwise, and I'm happy to get into the military particulars if people are interested. But also, there's a solution to this problem of the vacuum that will inevitably be created in Europe, and I think Putin is probably aware of this reality. In fact, he's probably acting on this reality more effectively and urgently than we are, which is our fault, not something we can hold. We can sort of get moralistic about. We should be acting on the reality as fast as the Kremlin. There is a solution to the vacuum, and the solution is that Europe is far more powerful than Russia, which is a threat, obviously, we see right now, to NATO. And Europe should take essentially the large shoulder of the burden of the conventional defense of Europe. And in that context, the United States should help Europe and should help provide weapons, of course, remain committed to NATO, specifically the extended nuclear deterrent, fungible high-end capabilities like space capabilities, maybe logistics and long-range bombers, so long, but always withholding enough forces to be able to effectively defend Taiwan should China choose to go. So that's the critical caveat. But I think that's very meaningful. And I think we should take an accordingly more supportive and lenient and sort of less stringent view on things like European military, on things like PESCO, on European views on the political structure or the political preferences in the European neighborhood, with the idea that Europe, if it's going to step up, it should also have more of a leading role and a more influential role. So that, in a sense, that's the model that Dwight Eisenhower had when NATO was created, and I think is actually faithful. In my view, it would be good to have a European SACEUR, for instance, because it would be primarily a European military effort with US support. This is the place we need to go to. We're not going there at all right now. In fact, we seem to be going the opposite direction. The fundamental reality I'd stress to a German audience is this isn't going to change the reality. It's going to happen that we're going to have to shift, because if we don't shift and the Chinese see an opening, I think they will probably move and we will be defeated. And then we will have to shift dramatically from like one day to the next. And this is what happened to the British in 1967 in the East of Suez moment, which was very difficult for the Gulf monarchies, but they had the Americans to step in, basically. So I think it's better for us to bring forward our reaction before this becomes a true crisis. And I'll be frank in closing. This is largely about Germany. I mean, the Brits spend more than their 2% on defense. Poland spends more. A lot of the Scandinavian countries are doing a lot. But Germany is the largest economy in Europe. It's the largest state in Europe, basically. It spends way too little on defense. It is capable of spending a lot more on defense. It did during the Cold War, when West Germany, 2/3 the size of the current Federal Republic, spent well over 3% of GDP on defense and fielded 12 active divisions on the inter-German border. So it's well within Germany's capacity, and Germany doesn't need to do that. It just needs to provide the kind of backbone within collective defense so that countries can plug in and basically be able to defeat a Russian invasion of Eastern NATO, which I think is a fair, given all the past and everything and how much Germany has benefited from NATO. That seems a fair request to me. I don't think that's unreasonable. But at the end of the day, here's the point. If Germany doesn't do it, it will be the Europeans who bear the costs and risks, in my view. And I think this is a mistake that the Biden administration is making, is it's actually obscuring that fact from Europe, because we will have to shift, because Americans' interests are primarily in Asia, and the political winds are definitely shifting towards a focus on China, not Europe. So this is a delaying function that is actually inhibiting focus. But my plea is for Germany in particular to step up to its historic and NATO responsibilities, as Max Hastings, I think, eloquently put in Bloomberg the other day. And you don't have to triple defense spending like Japan or Taiwan, where they really need to increase defense spending a lot. I don't think it would be that harmful for the average German. Certainly spend less than the average American spends on defense. So that would be my plea. I think we can have a more secure, good future together, but it is going to take change, as the old Italian novel says. If we want things to stay the same, they're going to have to change. So with that, look forward to the discussion.
Thank you for kicking us off to this discussion. Now, I'm sure we're going to get back to the German question later at some point, and can then discuss why or why that is not going to happen. But before I hand over to the co-panelists here, I do want to ask one question of you, and that is the question about the relationship between what's happening militarily, but also what's happening in other arenas. You ask, how can states in the book, how can states be assured they won't be left out high to dry if they join a coalition when China then targets them? Now, obviously, I think you're mainly talking about this in military terms, but I do think we also have to think of this very much in economic boycotts, in gray zone activity, and in a range of other activities. And you do address gray zone activities and say, there's been a bit of an overemphasis on it at the expense of, more hard military terms. But I do wonder, the two are linked. And in coalition building, it's going to be essential. Like if you look at what happened with South Korea and with THAAD, things like economic coercion and the actual ability of a country to join such an alliance, they're interlinked. They're not two separate things, and one blends into the other. So my question to you would, how would you respond to this relationship between, the hard military aspects that you focus on, but also much of what's surrounding it, whether that's economic coercion, whether that's cyber, whether that's any form of gray zone activities? What's your response to that?
Look, it's no, I mean, it's an issue, but as you know in the book, I mean, look, I'm trying to be as parsimonious as possible. I don't think that stuff works to the degree that China will need. We found, look, we've had an embargo on Cuba for 60 years and almost nothing to show for it. We've had sanctions on North Korea. We had put sanctions on Vietnam. We put sanctions on Russia. I'm not sure it had, and I mean, we put sanctions on Saddam Hussein. If you want to get a country to do something it really doesn't want to do, it's very hard to make economic sanctions work. Now, economic sanctions are important, and I'm all for that. But I think we will be able to kind of, in the course of time, we kind of know what the answer is with just sort of a geoeconomic scale. The politics is the difficulty with the death of TPP and so forth. Gray zone stuff, I mean, I know like the Taiwans and others are worried about it, but I don't see them giving up. I mean, I'm thinking about it from China's perspective. The gray zone stuff's probably backfired. I mean, the DPP was resoundingly reelected last time. Who knows what will happen next time? But even if they did, like, how would that work? So they shut down the phone grid, or like, the electricity grid in Taipei, and then people are going to surrender. They're going to just give in to China. Now, I think the more nuanced argument is that they will then be weakened in their resolve to do the things that are necessary to stand up to China. But then China's still got to ultimately have the kill shot. What's the kill mechanism? It's still the military force, right? So the gray zone is very relevant if it undermines Taiwan's will to spend and be prepared militarily. But at the end of the day, if China can't, I mean, I don't think China's going to hoodwink Taiwan out of its independence. And I think the same is true for South Korea. I mean, where I think economic sanctions can be much more effective is kind of on the margin, where it's countries are making decisions about a particular thing that they're not highly resolute on. But I mean, if you look in India as well, they've kicked out a lot of the Chinese companies and so forth, tech companies. So that's good news. I'm sanguine about, I mean, this is the same position I have towards the United States. I think we talk about sanctions way more than we should. I mean, they're a tool, but I think we exaggerate their salience. So that's, but I'm consistent because I'm saying I think the Chinese are going to find out the same thing. But this is exactly what happened in 2003. We tried sanctions and limited uses of military force for 10 years. And then George W. Bush got in there and said, I really want to get this guy to do what I want. I'm going to invade. That's the danger.
Okay, thanks. I'm sure we're going to get back to the question at some point in this discussion. But next, I want to bring in Bonnie Glaser. And Bonnie, if you could comment, give us your take both from a U.S. policy perspective, but also from the perspective as an expert on, China, Taiwan, and regional security affairs. Bonnie, over to you.
Well, thank you, Mareike. And, Bridge is doing everybody, I think, a great service by bringing these issues to the attention of the public and policymakers and promoting a debate about them, because they're really important. We, of course, come to this set of issues from a different place. Bridge is a defense expert. I am a regionalist. But we agree on a few crucial points, and I think the most crucial one being that deterrence needs to be strengthened in the Taiwan Strait, that the United States has to have the capability to deal with China's growing military area, anti-access area denial capabilities. And we want to ensure that China doesn't believe it has the confidence to settle disputes, for example, in the region through military force, or bring the region under its own hegemony. There's already a question in the chat about just whether China just seeks to sort of make the population, the lives and living standards of its population better. I think that there's an ample amount of evidence that China has not only regional ambitions, but also global ambitions. And I think it's not about hostility necessarily toward the United States, but they want to shape the international order so that it is more beneficial to them, to their illiberal norms. And there's a great deal of evidence of this, and not only in their actions, but also in their documents, and blunting the United States pushing back against what the US and Western countries have wanted to see the liberal international order produce, has been actually in place for a very long time. And China's capabilities have grown, and they have become, I think, more willing and more capable of influencing the international order. But I emphasize that the China challenge is it's not only not just regional, it's global, but it's also not just military. And we have to be, I think, prepared, like-minded countries, to devote our energy and resources to many aspects of the challenge. We have to maintain our lead in key strategic technologies. We have to compete with the Belt and Road and provide infrastructure loans. We have to protect the universal definition of human rights at the UN and preserve the free internet. We have to prevent China from using coercion against claimants in the South China Sea and using economic coercion against countries. So it's a very long list of things that I think we need to do and we need to be working on. So the defense piece is important, but I believe we cannot separate it out from the other pieces. In fact, we might play into Beijing's hands if we actually only focus on the defense piece. Secondly, something that Bridge and I have talked about and sparred over is the issue of gray zone threats, and we do see that particular issue differently, and especially as it pertains to Taiwan. In my view, Taiwan has to strike the right balance of allocating its resources to gray zone threats that it faces and preventing the PLA from landing on the beach and seizing and controlling Taiwan. So we could debate what the right balance should be, but I think ignoring those military incursions in the air defense identification zone wouldn't be the right policy. It isn't really an option for a democratically elected government that has to demonstrate to its people that it can defend the interests of their country. It is connected to the need for the people to have confidence in their government that they can protect them, not just prevent the PLA from landing. Then that's important too, but actually the people they're less urgent about the military threat to begin with, not to mention all of the gray zone tactics. There's a lot of work, I would say, that Taiwan needs to do, which takes me to another point that I think really needs to be underscored, that no US effort to defend Taiwan can be effective without Taiwan doing its part. So, the list is just very long, procuring asymmetric weapons and developing effective operational concepts and enhancing their training, revamping the reserve force, and building, I believe, a civilian territorial defense capability. These are just some of the things that Taiwan needs to do. It's not just about defense spending. It's really about what they're doing with their defense resources as well. And I think that that's where we should be focusing an enormous amount of our effort. We just can't do it ourselves. I think it's also important just to emphasize that China's military threat to Taiwan really has to be viewed as part of a broader strategy. I mean, let's remember the Civil War has been going on since 1949. The strategy has evolved as China's capabilities have evolved, but its objective has remained the same. And so they use cyber threats and disinformation, united front tactics, and other forms of hybrid warfare. But the goal still is to win without fighting. They seek to instill a sense of psychological despair within the people, so that the people and the government essentially abandon hope of remaining autonomous from the PRC and agree to political talks on unification. And that's where the gray zone tactics come in, that by instilling the sense of despair, you end up potentially with the people supporting a government to go ahead and open political talks because they conclude, if we don't do it now, we'll get an even worse deal later. Now, all of this is not the desire that the people want, and certainly they don't trust China after what has taken place in Hong Kong. But I still think that the gray zone piece of it is important. So I think there just needs to be a balance there. And then finally, I'm not going to step too far into this debate about Europe. You've been having a debate on Twitter, I think, Bridge, about this issue. But I think that it would be a mistake for the United States to focus so solely like a laser on China in the Indo-Pacific and essentially abandon Europe. And I know you haven't used that phrase, and that's not that, you know, exactly what you're saying. But I think we have to strike the right balance between the theaters and the right strategy. Today, Europe cannot defend itself. The United States must be part of that equation. And yes, I would like to see Germany step up and have a plan over time to build the capability to do more than it can do today. But I think it's a mistake for us to signal our NATO allies today that fight in China is so important, that strategy of denial and deterring China, that we should not, that we would signal them that we would not help defend Europe if we need to. So I think that that's something that's worth talking about as well. So I'll stop there. Look forward to the further discussion.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, for your input. I'll give Bridge a chance to respond later, and I have multiple follow-up questions for all of the panelists. But first, I wanna bring in Veerle to comment on this topic from a European angle, from that perspective. Veerle, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mareike. It's a pleasure to be here and to be on the panel with Bonnie and Bridge. And thanks to GMF more broadly. It's a great discussion so far. Look, I'm speaking on my perspective as an Asia specialist sitting in Europe. So that's what I'll focus on. But look, I think, having read the book, I think it made some really important points. Bonnie has already touched on them, but the centrality of Asia as a primary theater and the reason for that, I think, is very clearly laid out. The China challenge and the rise of China as not necessarily being a benign rise, I think is one that definitely merits further consideration and really primacy. Secondly, I think the realization of the need for prioritization in policy and also burden sharing is, I think, incredibly important. The fact that we can't be everywhere doing everything all the time. And we need to find collaborative solutions to that is one that really struck me. But then also finally, I think the point on credibility was really, really important. And the fact that credibility in terms of action in other theaters does not necessarily impact credibility in, say, Asia. So, the US withdrawal from Kabul, for example, from Afghanistan, does not necessarily equate to a loss of credibility over Taiwan. That's something that I definitely think is very important to stress. But I do have some questions. Looking at it, and Bonnie's already touched on this, in terms of separation, a division of tasks or a division of burden sharing, I fully agree that Europe can't just be left to Europe and Asia can't just be left to the United States and a few other partners. I think that's also an incredibly important signal to send at a time when European countries are becoming more interested in the Indo-Pacific region, and countries like the UK see themselves playing a very important role there, maybe not a primary role, the same level of the United States, but certainly a supportive one. And so I would echo what Bonnie says in terms of finding ways to shift emphasis, but not necessarily exclude participation in one or the other. I think when it comes to some of the things that the book talked about, I found that the perspective quite high level, and it didn't necessarily take into consideration some of the more sensitive, domestic political perspectives and ideological perspectives. And so that's one area that I think, in terms of anticipating Chinese behavior, anticipating Chinese responses, and even risk taking, would be one where I think further, maybe that's something that we can discuss today, but that's one where I think a deeper interrogation of kind of ideology as well would be required. The same goes, for example, when it comes to the anti-China hegemonic kind of partnership building. There was a discussion, for example, over the tensions between South Korea and Japan, but how those ultimately would not necessarily be an obstacle, but it doesn't really touch upon some of the other, say, intra-ASEAN tensions that exist. When it comes to the alliance as well, I found it really interesting to note that Russia was seen as a potential partner in this, whereas in Europe, of course, we are increasingly talking about the potential for greater Russia-China collaboration, and that's not just in terms of coordination of specific scenarios. So as we've seen a lot of commentators make at the moment vis-a-vis Ukraine and Taiwan, and having a two-front approach, but more generally coordination and interests of Russia in the Indo-Pacific more broadly, and how those marry up with China and thus change that military strategic calculation for Beijing and its own grouping or coalition as such. I think also, and I would really echo this as the third person, I'm so sorry, gray zone challenges. I fully agree. I think you can't separate those from the military dimension. The book speaks about how gray zone in terms of a maritime approach is about, occupying small pockets of territory. Ultimately, that won't, make a big difference. But Bonnie, I think really, hit the nail on the head in terms of the political impact and the civilian impact of gray zone tactics. There's a psychological side, and this extends beyond just maritime gray zone warfare, but it includes, disinformation operations and cyber operations, not just in Taiwan, but really across the board as well in the rest of the region. And it impacts also livelihoods. And I think that's another part where in terms of countries making that consideration, if it is about food security, if it is about other crucial elements of sustainability and stability in the region, then that is going to affect, once again, the calculations that countries make. And when it comes to the importance of economic policy, I think CPTPP was already mentioned very briefly, but if we're talking about credibility, that is one area where the United States willingly, I think, lost credibility to its own, unfortunately, by its own initiative. So, I think when we look at the military aspect of strategy, it really has to be part of a broader, more comprehensive approach. And just finally, one thing that I thought was really interesting was the discussion around the escalation, de-escalation mechanisms and initiatives. I think in terms of escalation, I wanted to ask, does a Taiwan scenario, it seemed very much, if we're looking at a conquest scenario, it seemed very much focused on simply Taiwan as an island, and it didn't necessarily include or consider the possibility of China also simultaneously targeting US assets, for example, in Japan, which would, of course, change Beijing's calculation in a more kinetic advancement. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that. And then second of all, in terms of de-escalation, I think there was a mention of, say, an off-ramp for China in that, finding a way in which China could end a Taiwan scenario without humiliation or public surrendering. That would be a feasible off-ramp for China, but I'm not really sure what that looks like, quite frankly. I mean, if we look at the sensitivity and the centrality of Taiwan for CCP legitimacy, if we are envisioning a conquest scenario and one where the CCP does not succeed, then that is ultimately, again, a survivability issue. So, and a credibility issue for the CCP itself. So I wasn't quite sure how those off-ramps, would really play out. And then again, of course, in terms of a European, what Europe can do with regards to Taiwan, with regards to either the softer or military aspects of a strategy for denial, I would be, really interested to hear what your thoughts are on that, but I'll leave it at that.
Many thanks, Veerle, for those excellent points as well. Now, I have a ton of questions, and questions are beginning to trickle in from the audience. Again, if you have a question, feel free to leave it in the Q&A box. But before we get to the question round, I do want to give Bridge, the opportunity to respond to any or all of the points raised by Bonnie and Veerle, what some of the questions or some of the points that were made. Bridge, over to you.
Yeah, I'm going to be a bit brief, but I'm going to try to make a core kind of fundamental point. And thanks for the thoughtful comments from both of the Bonnie and Veerle. I mean, I'm especially talking here to a European audience. We need to reckon seriously with hard power. Like, a lot of the comment, gray zone, the global aspect, that's ultimately comes down to how important is hard power, and particularly economic wealth, and how it translates into military power. As Chairman Mao rightly said, power ultimately comes out of a barrel of a gun. I'm a realist. Thomas Hobbes, Thucydides, whoever. Obviously, Germany is ground zero of the sort of liberal view of international relations, at least ostensibly. Not sure, actually, I think Germans are incredibly realist in practice, which I'm almost jealous. But this is the fundamental point. So when I sent the book to Bob Jervis, the late and great Bob Jervis, before he passed away, and he said something, is this too military? So I put a very clear statement in the beginning. This military power is not everything, but if you don't get it right, it will be dominant. And the gray zone. So I mean, really, what I'm trying to do with this book, it's ultimately a defense strategy book. That's one part of policy. On the other hand, if you don't get it right, it will be dominant, right? And I mean, the history of Europe is a clear testimony to that, certainly the Cold War and before. And so, and in a sense, we have to take care of the hard power problem first and make sure we're good to go there before we get distracted. And that's the real debate that Bonnie, I think, tabled, is actually. So for instance, Jake Sullivan and Hal Brands responded to an earlier piece I'd done that kind of built on the book's ideas. And they said, no, the problem is global. It's all levers of power. Now, here's the irony, and I don't want to put words into Bonnie's mouth, but that makes the competition with China more like the Cold War, a full-scale, totalistic competition, ideological, essentially to the death, right? And competing everywhere. My view is actually more narrow. So it's more hardline in a way. But I actually, as I've expressed publicly, my view is that we could have come to détente with China if we take care of the hard power dimension. Now, that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here. But I think the thing I want to stress to this audience, and it's so important for Germans to understand, is the hard power realities must be grappled with, and delay is not going to improve it. So just to give an example, we don't have a military that's large enough to fight China and Russia anywhere near simultaneously. So the question that an American administration would have to answer is, if war broke out, even in one theater, even in Europe against NATO, and there was a possibility that it would break out in Asia, how would we allocate the 20 B-2s that we have, the 20 penetrating stealthy bombers that we have? That's it. Or how would we allocate the submarines that we need? Because those things, I mean, this sounds arcane. It sounds narrow, but it's not, because as Shakespeare said, for want of a shoe, the kingdom was lost. I mean, the Germans defeated the Anglo-French-Belgian forces in 1940 because they broke through in the Ardennes, which was not necessarily how it had to be if the French had arrayed their forces in a different place. And this is the thing, is you can have transformative systemic effects internationally through relatively small wars. And German history is especially illuminating here, because the wars of German unification are the perfect example, where Berlin was able to fight three, by the standards of European history, relatively small wars, and fundamentally change the map of Europe and cause immense damage in doing so over time, although it results in the unification of Germany. So that was a positive for Germans. But that's what we have to be afraid of. And before you know it, things have fundamentally changed. And the kind of line that I use is that Churchill apparently said that you can fight two wars or you can win one. Well, in 1941, when Japan attacked the United States and killed American sailors in Honolulu, Pearl Harbor, the United States said, we're going to fight Germany first. Because if we beat Germany first, we know we will beat Japan. But if we beat Japan first, we're not sure we're going to beat Germany. And if the war is lost in Europe, everything will be lost. And that's the level. It sounds simplistic. It sounds old-fashioned. But the Chinese are building a military to fight. And the Russians, I mean, if we've seen anything in the last couple of weeks, and I have no idea what the Kremlin's going to do, is they certainly believe in hard power, right? I mean, they've invested in hard power. And that's the reality that we need to grapple with. So what I want to do is I want to ground our policy in a realistic assessment of what our scarcity is, what our plan is, and then make a plan together based on that. And the reality is that nobody can fight China other than us, really. If we are not the big player there, the Asian countries will lose because China is just too strong. And there is a tendency, I will say, and certainly not with this group here, but there is a tendency, I think, in the transatlantic conversation to discount China. And I find that strange because China is clearly incredibly impressive, scary in a lot of ways, and not going anywhere. So with that, I mean, I think that's the kind of maybe the point that I would, if nothing else, if the German conversation were to grapple more with the hard power reality, at least at the level of, you know, the top level of discussion, I think we'd all be better off.
Many thanks, Bridge. And I mean, this is quite literally why we're here, because I personally agree that this hard power aspect is something that Germany needs to talk more about and come up with a more realistic take on how power works in the world. This is part of why we're here to have this discussion also with the German and with the European audience. Before I go to questions from the audience, I have two questions that I want to pose to the entire panel, and you can pick and choose which one you want to respond to. So the first one actually has to do with the question of Germany in this case. Now, my personal conviction, and this is just my own take, is I don't think Germany is going to step up. I think the debate in Germany is in such a way that I don't really see Germany increasing its military spending. I don't see many possibilities there. I don't even see a whole lot of possibilities for this discussion to get started in a very meaningful way. So to you or to anybody else in the Bridge or to anybody else, what's the solution here? Would this be in the end, from a US perspective, well, cut your losses, get out, and say, Germany, that's your problem? So what's the adequate response if this does not happen? And the second question I want to ask to the entire panel is another one where I know there's some disagreement in the room, and this is why I want to bring this up. It's the question of strategic ambiguity when it comes to Taiwan. Bridge, you make a case for eliminating strategic ambiguity. Now I know that Bonnie is, I think, quite in favor of keeping strategic ambiguity. So I just want to throw that out there. Like, what are the arguments in favor of or against strategic ambiguity?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll jump in if you don't mind, with the permission of the other panelists, just because I think the first one in particular is so critical. And Mareike, and I thank you for your frankness, because I think this is important. Look, the critical thing is we are at the point where we need to judge countries by their results, by the anticipatable consequences of their policies, not their stated intentions. And we need to move past the time where we say, oh, Germany has this particular way, because the results of Germany's policies are, as I told the Süddeutsche Zeitung the other day, borderline antagonistic at this point. I mean, that's the reality. And there is a strong sense, particularly on the Republican side, but I think it's going to rise on the Democratic side over time as well, that this is not tolerable anymore. And I think we are, in a sense, in a crisis in the alliance relationship. The exact opposite of what President Biden said. He is wrong and is harmful to the relationship to perpetuate the sense in Germany that is how things are going. I mean, there are people on national television in the United States all the time, and not the fringe, Wall Street Journal op-ed page, saying that Germany is a serious problem. And so, Germans saying, I don't want to do this, I don't feel it's not our history. No, because the other European countries are doing it. So the alternative for us, we can get angry, but I think we'll have to act accordingly. We're going to have to assess Germany's behavior, its results, and then act accordingly. So things like our position towards the European Union, our position towards things that Germany does want, economic relationship with other European states, and the United States' significant leverage. I mean, basically, if we can't work with Germany to create a secure Europe that's reasonably stable, we have to work with others in Europe. And that's going to be suboptimal. And by the way, the situation will be suboptimal anyway, because if Germany doesn't step up, there is going to be vulnerability, and there's going to be more room for Russia to be aggressive, and the potential for intra-European competition and rivalry to reemerge. And that's not good, but that is going to happen because the United States has to prioritize and cannot continue the way it is. So you know, I mean, I'm really, I almost have, Max Hastings' piece was just very good. It was almost elegiac. I mean, I consider myself a Teutonophile. It's not a big group. You know, usually you have Francophiles and Anglo. I love Germany. It's not, but so maybe maybe I'm naive to think that Germans are capable, and Germany is capable of stepping up in the way that it did after the war, when it rearmed and when the Bundeswehr was by far the most powerful European military force. So I know it's within Germany's capacity. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, let's strip away all this transatlantic rhetoric. That's obviously, I mean, people are not winning elections in America on transatlantic rhetoric. Trust me. That is a wasting asset. Biden is probably the last gasp of that, right? So if that's the case, then let's be honest with each other so we can actually see this situation clearly and adapt. Because this is the chance. Otherwise, it will be Europe that will bear the consequences of the shift to Asia, because that's, you know, in the same way that, to use the historical example, the British position in Asia really fell apart in 1941, 1942, because they had to shift, but otherwise they were going to be conquered by the Wehrmacht. So that was the primary theater. So you know, anyway, and on strategic ambiguity, I actually think we're in a pretty good position where we formally keep the position, but everybody understands what we would really do, which is I think it's cheating kind of, but it's good for policy.
Thank you. Any comments from Veerle or Bonnie?
Well, I will answer your second question and give a bit of a longer answer. Though I don't disagree with what you just said, Bridge. But first, just very quick definition, you know, 1954 to 1979, the United States had a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. So we had a commitment to come to Taiwan's defense. And since then, we have not made clear whether we would. So that's our position, is described as strategic ambiguity. Nobody knows whether it is certain that the United States would intervene if China attacked Taiwan. The people who advocate strategic clarity want the United States to say, under all contingencies, the United States will come to Taiwan's aid, and have that be a position that is stated by the president, which I think one of the reasons why I don't support it is that I think a president should have flexibility in various circumstances. But that's not the main reason. But why do people advocate strategic clarity? Because China has a conventional advantage, and people are worried that China might miscalculate or might decide that it can, in fact, take over Taiwan. It might, some people say, assume that the United States would not intervene. So people are looking for a quick fix, right? A change in our declaratory policy, because we can't do it any other way. And we have to ensure that that war doesn't happen. So there's these two particular premises that I think people who advocate strategic clarity have in mind that are incorrect. The first is the premise that China does not believe that the United States would intervene, that they think that Taiwan's more important to them than it is to the United States. And so at the end of the day, China would attack and we would essentially do very little. So that all of Chinese modernization since the late 1990s, its defense modernization, has been based on dealing with an intervening US force. Long before the Chinese started to actually develop capabilities to have amphibious landing on Taiwan, they were dealing with the potential for an intervening US force. I mean, why did they develop things like their, you know, carrier killer missile, the DF-26, right? Because they wanted to have the anti-access area denial capabilities. So I believe that China is preparing for a US intervention. The second assumption, which I think is wrong, and it's actually even more dangerous, is that people believe, who advocate strategic clarity, that having the United States articulate this position will in fact deter a Chinese attack. And my argument, which I have made in various things that I've written, is that it is more likely to provoke a Chinese attack. That part of the normalization understanding that the United States had with China was breaking that treaty. You know, we can get away with a lot in our one China policy, but actually restoring our defense commitment to Taiwan, I think, would lead Beijing to conclude that it would push Xi Jinping into a corner because the elite would be saying you have to defend territorial integrity and sovereignty. So he would be more likely to say, well, if we have an advantage now, we really should go now, because the United States is moving toward even restoring diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. And this is what I think would be the outcome of a statement of strategic clarity. So it would not end up deterring the attack, it would end up provoking it.
Thank you, Bonnie, for laying out that position very, very clearly. Veerle, any comments from you on either of the questions?
I mean, just I guess on the latter is more my area, but no, I honestly completely agree with Bonnie. I think strategic ambiguity really works in the US's favor and in Taiwan's favor as well. And I think, more generally, how countries frame Taiwan, and given the increase of Taiwan in statements, in more, policy circles, both in the region and further afield, I think how you frame Taiwan, how you address Taiwan publicly, all of that really needs to be taken into careful consideration, because as Bonnie has pointed out, there are different segments of or different key stakeholder groups in China will be arguing quite severely in reaction to this. So the kind of domestic debate really does need to be at the elite level as well, does really need to be kept into consideration.
Yeah, thank you very much.
If I could just say, really, this is a great
Go
example
ahead, go
where
ahead.
the hard
Sure.
power is what matters. And Bonnie and I, we agree more than we like to admit, but is that this is about making sure that we can do it. And it's a conceit of our own that it's all about what we say. And it's like, and I agree with everything that Bonnie said. So, I mean, we shouldn't, I think the Biden administration is probably being too provocative on Taiwan, rhetorically. They should be focused on the stuff that we need, so we wouldn't have this problem now.
Thank you. I'm glad to see a lot of agreement actually on this panel. So at least on the basics, we can pretty much agree. I do want to move to some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience. Again, if you have something to add, put it in the Q&A box. But maybe I'll start with two. And one is one comment mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative and how China is building roads, et cetera, et cetera. But we have a separate question as well directed to Bonnie, but I think anybody on the panel feel free to answer. How should the US compete with China's Belt and Road? What are the best ways for the US, or I would add even for its allies and partners, to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative? And another question that's come in is about South Korea, and a question from someone in the audience, intrigued by your omission of South Korea from the list of countries that are vulnerable to China's short and sharp war for the demonstrative effect. So South Korea is often seen as the weak link in the US alliance system and is quite vulnerable, as we've already said, to China's economic coercion. So why is it because South Korea is unlikely to become a target of China's military threat? What's your assessment on what the role of South Korea is? That last question goes to Bridge. So
I defer to Veerle or Bonnie on the BRI. I can answer the South Korea one, but I don't want to keep going first.
Bonnie, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, Mareike, you probably have your own thoughts on this, but I'll be very brief, as we really want to be talking about Bridges issues. I think that first of all, we shouldn't take the position that every single loan that China gives to a country is by definition bad, right? I mean, we should be helping countries to ensure that they have the capacity to negotiate good deals with China, so that they get good terms, so that a lot of countries, I think, don't have that capability. And there are examples where actually countries have negotiated very bad deals. Malaysia was a good example early on, and then that was renegotiated. So I am not just against all of Chinese resources and loans for connectivity and infrastructure around the world. So that's point one. But point two, I think, is that the Trump administration and the Biden administration have both come up with some ideas for how to provide countries with alternatives. That's what we should be doing, and along with Japan and other countries that have resources. The problem is the plans so far have all been intended and really based on the assumption that we would be able to get to mobilize private capital to get into these developing countries. And I think that just has not happened. So the public sector is not putting forward enough resources and expecting that if they send the right signals, that private capital will then move into these countries. And I think that in many of them, the political risks are just too high. So where we're falling short is resources. Now, Global Gateway is trying to change that by putting forward some resources. I think that the US, in what we are trying to do, Build Back Better World, is similar, but we still, I think, don't have enough resources. I think that's what we really need to do. We have to get more countries to contribute more resources so that we provide countries with alternatives. But we shouldn't be be anti-China in everything that the Chinese do. So those are the two aspects that I think that we're not doing well enough. And if we continue to just focus on what I think is this strategy of mobilizing private capital, we'll probably continue to fail. We also face challenges of things like different bureaucracies. As the US, Japan, and Australia found out when they tried to come up with some projects to jointly fund, it took 2 years to fund the first project. And I think that was in Palau, if I'm not mistaken. So we've got to figure out how to expedite this, make it more effective.
Thank you, Bonnie. Yeah, I'm joining us all today from Nairobi. So a very, very relevant question for me. One thing that actually stands out here quite very much is the Japanese presence, much more so than the US presence or the European presence even. But I want to go to Bridge and give you a chance to answer the question about what role South Korea plays in all of this.
No, South Korea is an excellent question. In fact, in the book, I do discuss the possibility for a Chinese attack on South Korea. Again, from a defense planning point of view, the idea would not be that China would seek to annex the Korean Peninsula necessarily, who knows, but rather that if you want to generate that degree of coercion, to force a disaffiliation from a U.S. alliance, you may need to at least have the credible ability to invade. And people like to say that Taiwan's 100 miles off the Chinese coast. Well, so is South Korea from the Shandong Peninsula. And all of the air assault and, of course, strike and amphibious capabilities that could be used against Taiwan are also going to be used against South Korea. I mean, remember the Incheon landing in 1950. So, in fact, I wrote something in the South Korean press about a year ago, and it kind of expression in English, a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it. I don't know if the discussion there is so obviously focused on North Korea, and the current government is, without getting too much into it, it's not perfectly aligned with our perspective on China, I think. That said, I would expect over time the Koreans to be increasingly kind of with us. That's my hope. One thing I do that I maybe in response kind of to some of Veerle's comments, when I was thinking about not only the anti-hegemonic coalition as a whole, but certainly American alliances within it, I do try to be sensitive to the political dynamic. So part of the reason for defending Taiwan is there is this very strong constituency, majority on Taiwan that does not want to be subsumed by China. I'm not sure the same degree of resolve is there with Malaysia or Thailand or let alone Indonesia. And so what we want is we want to build our defense perimeter around the countries that have a resolve, and US allies tend to be in a good place there. And so I was very attentive to that dynamic, but also in what we ask of our allies. I mean, one of the key things, and this is relevant to Germany, is I'm not of the view that European powers should be trying to project military power to the Asia Pacific. And I've told the British and the French this repeatedly, partially because it will be negligible, and also because that effort would be much more, have a much greater impact, excuse me, if it's allocated to Europe. But similarly with the Koreans, one of the reasons I'm sanguine about the Korean-Japanese troubles, which are unlikely to go away in the near term, I mean, in my experience, is that if, Korea is focused on primarily on its self-defense, and Japan is focused on self-defense, but also the Taiwan scenario. And of course, if there were a Korea scenario, it would be also relevant as well. And so, and I, in the book, I talk a lot about the potential for Chinese attacks on the broader US basing architecture. This is the idea of the binding strategy. So I think Korea is going to be very important, and actually is one of the reasons why deep cuts to the army, the US Army, may not be advised, because even as the US Army is not needed to deal with the North Korean Army, over time it could be necessary to deal with the PLA from a defense planning point of view. Similarly in the Philippines.
Thank you, Bridge. And Veerle, I also want to give you a chance to respond to the question on the BRI, how to compete effectively with China in this arena.
Yeah, I just wanted to say very quickly a few additional points to the issue of trying to make this a public-private partnership. That has, of course, been a struggle, but I think there are other areas as well which so far have complicated the rollout of the initiatives that we have seen, for example, on the Blue Dot Initiative, where there have been some projects, but they have taken a while, and there haven't been many. And I think as we see others come online as well, this will continue to be the case. I think there's two additional issues. The first is, of course, that project identification and then implementation in terms of who is involved in the process of project selection, in terms of actual allocation of tasks. All of that, I think, is quite unclear. And if you try and do that as well in a multilateral way, then that becomes quite difficult. So it will be interesting to see how things like the World Build Back Better World Initiative will come online. And just secondly as well, I think one thing that we have to remember, of course, is that all of these initiatives are built on high standards. And so, things like impact assessments, all of that takes an immense amount of time and really extends that project delivery timeline. So when we even talk about, you've mentioned like Japanese projects, when I speak to Southeast Asians, they've said in the past, well, Japanese infrastructure is undoubtedly in better quality and more sustainable, but it takes an incredibly long time to really deliver. And so that will be the case for these initiatives as well. So I think when we think about, how to roll out these initiatives, I think the ultimate objective has to be kept in mind. What is your objective? You're not going to be able to match China on the BRI, nor should you necessarily. And as Bonnie said, not all BRI projects are problematic, but that makes project selection and implementation all the more important.
Thank you, Veerle. We have another question. This one's for Bridge, but anybody can feel free to jump in. So the question is, might not closer cooperation between Russia and China create a situation where it is increasingly difficult for the US to cleanly differentiate between the two different theaters? We're not there yet, but we may never get there, but there is some risk of Russian-Chinese cooperation in Asia and in Europe, and it does seem to be, if at all, it does seem to be rising. So what do we make of that? That cooperation and what that may mean for clearly separating theaters going forward.
Well, it's a real indictment of U.S. statecraft over the last generation that we've reached this point. It's like a basic, truism of geopolitics that, from a U.S. point of view, you don't want to have Russia and China close together. We don't need to be best friends with Russia, but this is a really, really bad situation that we're in. And, frankly, at the same time that we're cutting the defense budget, and I'm not a big fan of dramatic increase to the defense budget, but if we're going to have hostile relations with both, and I defer to Bonnie on this one, but it seems like a degree of collaboration and closeness at a personal level that hasn't existed since Mao and Stalin. It's pretty bad. So anyway, that's the reality. I actually think if China continues rising, Russia's position is going to become untenable with Beijing. So it is transitory, but a lot of bad things can happen in that period. In the long run, we're all dead, as Keynes said. But one thing, people are making this argument, and I thank you for the question. I don't see how it changes anything that I'm saying. The fact that Japan and Germany were allied in the Axis relationship didn't change the primacy of the European theater at the time, given this level of state power and so forth. The fact remains, it actually just makes it more acute for Europe, because in theory, if Russia and China were not so closely aligned, then there wouldn't be as much of a challenge of near simultaneous or concurrent conflicts. So I mean, just practically, if we use up a ton of munitions fighting Russia, those aren't going to be available. Some of those take years to build, let alone the aircraft that are carrying them, or the submarines or something. And the Russian military is no joke. I mean, it's really serious. I mean, a lot of our military people, in some areas, the Russians are still the best, better than the Chinese or the Americans in certain areas, artillery, for instance. To me, that just is all the more reason for Europe to be stepping up, because the Russians are they're trying to take advantage of the situation. But that it doesn't change any of the basic. The fact that Asia is primary and that China is the most significant threat is not at all affected by whether there's a crisis or even conflict in Europe. It's just, and again, the Pearl Harbor example, and we didn't follow it as well as we could have, but bear in mind that the Americans alone were a larger economy than Germany and Imperial Japan combined at the time, let alone along with the Soviet Union and the British Empire. That would not be the situation in a conflict with Europe, because we have all these, people like to say we have all these allies and yada, 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 but that's all theoretical, because and this is exactly the point, is Germany is a huge economy, but Germany doesn't allocate any of it to the military in a meaningful way, and is not even willing to put a lot of its political leverage to work for allied ends, like on Nord Stream 2, or the way, blocking transfer of weapon systems to the Ukrainians and so forth. It's a perfect example of how our alliance system is actually less than the sum of its parts. So that's what we have to change if it's going to survive. Thanks.
Thank you for that. We're slowly coming towards the end. I have two more questions from the audience that I want to throw to the entire panel. And the first one is about another contentious issue, and that is AUKUS. And the question is, with trying to get Europe to shoulder a greater burden in this theater, why offend France, which arguably is, one of the stronger countries in this regard? That is one question from the audience, and the other, I'm taking two together. One question asks about, what's the reason behind what China is doing? Is it hostility towards the U.S.? Is it trying to get a better life for its own people? What is the main reason from China here? And relatedly, how are some of the developments in China itself that China is facing, such as demographic pressure? How would that actually impact China's actions and China's strategy here? I know those are both two very big questions, but I want to give you a chance to respond to these audience questions. Any volunteers who want to go first?
Well, I can, but again, I don't want to.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, sorry. On AUKUS, clearly was not so well handled from a diplomatic point of view, but this is what I'm sure Bonnie and Veerle have the similar experience in Asia with our allies. It's great. It's all upside. It's wonderful. In Europe, it's like the worst thing that ever happened. So, I think it makes sense for the Australians to be building nuclear-powered submarines, because if they build conventional submarines, they can't go that far off the coast of Australia. So with nuclear submarines, they can help us in the tough battles. So that's great. Australia is the best ally we have, because they spend a lot on defense and they're orienting their military towards collective defense scenarios. That's the model, as far as I'm concerned. So look, I'm actually sympathetic to the French in terms of their views on a new deal, a new transatlantic bargain. I think President Macron, the idea of a third pole or disalignment from the United States is counterproductive, because why are we going to make a deal in which we create an alternate pole? That doesn't make any sense. But the basic idea there is a good one. I think that my view is actually, I think, quite close to what I think, if I could say, a better version of the French argument could be, which is, in a sense, to use American resources to make Europe stronger, right? Because we can't do as much, but we have a lot. We have a lot of military capability. We have a lot of political capital. and France is just, and Europe is not very cohesive in security terms. So, okay, here, we'll help you and you can have a louder voice, but just don't say that you're going to be halfway between China and America. The only reason that we can make the deal is if we're basically on the same side vis-a-vis China, not expecting them to fight in a Taiwan fight, but like more on the geoeconomic scale, things like Bonnie was talking about, like the technology standards and trade, that kind of stuff. And then why is China doing what's doing? I mean, Veerle and Bonnie would be better equipped to answer this, but I mean, it's what great powers always do. And it's because it's pretty great. I mean, like if you get to be the center of the world system, the world economy, you get the best jobs. My friend Michael Lind is a very interesting thinker. He says there's a difference between wealth and prosperity. Prosperity is like an objective reality, that you have enough food and shelter, but wealth is a relative thing. And the Chinese are acutely, as I can see, they're acutely conscious of the relative standing. In fact, the century of humiliation is all about humiliation as a relative standard. And they want to, probably eventually want to have the world's reserve currency. They want to have the world's best companies, the world's best universities, and not send the kids of Chinese leaders to Princeton or whatever. That they're going to have it. They're going to go Tsinghua. People are going to go to Tsinghua, and that's where, and they're going to set the standards, and their regulations are going to be, to use the European term, a regulatory superpower. They're going to be a regulatory superpower if they have, because they're going to control access to the Asian market, and we're all just going to have to do what they. Oh, yes, I accept your rules, and that's, I think, what they want. And then the long-term prognosis, I find I don't know. I'm not an economist. I don't invest for a living, but there's the people who say the Chinese economy is about to collapse tend to be people who are not putting money to work. The people who have a lot of money, that big companies and investors, seem to think that the Chinese economy still got legs. It's possible it will slow down, but they still have hundreds of millions of people out in the, not in the countryside, but at lower levels of development from where they are. They have a ton of catch-up growth they have to do, and they're at the forefront of technology development. They're at the forefront of human development in a lot of areas. AI, Eric Schmidt's always making this point about AI, artificial intelligence, for instance. So it's possible that they could fall apart. I certainly don't think we should bet on it.
Thank you, Bridge. I want to hand to Veerle and Bonnie, and then we'll have one last round of concluding thoughts. So you can start thinking about, any final points you want to make in this webinar. But first, I want to give Veerle and Bonnie the opportunity to respond to the questions raised by the audience.
So I'll just jump in on a couple of things. I like the way Bridge described how China thinks about its interests. Its history is important, the century of national humiliation. The Chinese have been a dissatisfied power for a long time, and they have not pressed their interests because they haven't had the capabilities to do so. And now they do. There's a very popular phrase in China, the East is rising, the West is declining. We know that the Chinese have, at least since the global financial crisis, 2007-8, believe that the United States is in decline, and they are trying to accelerate a shift in the international order so that China's prominence is more important and its interests are addressed. These begin with things like territorial disputes, obviously, with lots of countries. I think it's Southeast Asia and then Japan and India, Taiwan, and there's still a lot of territorial disputes that remain. But as I said at the top of this webinar, that their ambitions really are much more ambitious, and we see them very active in the United Nations in trying to change some of the rules of the road. They have created some new institutions, none of which have been very effective in challenging international rules, but I don't rule out that they will get there. I agree with Bridge on the economy, but the Chinese economy is very much slowing down. Economists that I look to predict that their growth this year will be somewhere between 0 and 4%. But the demographic piece is one that I think it does require more study. What does it mean? For manufacturing, the Chinese are automating. They are predicting in advance how that demographic slowdown. They've known that it's coming. It's just coming more quickly than I think that they had projected. But what does it mean for national defense and security? I'm not too sure. The Chinese may not be able to have a 1 million man army. But that doesn't mean that they won't have the combination of the force that is well trained and the weapons to execute the missions that they have. But that's a question I myself have not researched. And then finally, I just want to say I'm very reluctant to rank the order of importance of our allies, Bridge. And I will say that yes, Australia is extremely important. But when it comes to the Taiwan Strait, and you and I would agree that is the most likely place for the US and China to go to war, Japan is more likely to get involved. For Japan, Taiwan is truly existential, right? I mean, it is so close to their territory. They believe that if the Chinese were to occupy Taiwan, that would enable China to block sea lanes of communication, prevent delivery of energy supplies to Japan. So they are more motivated than any other country to see that Taiwan does not become part of the People's Republic of China. And the Australians, of course, and recently their Defense Minister, Peter Dutton, said, well, we fought in every war with the United States, and basically implied, why would this be any different? But I still think it would be a choice, it would be a decision that I could envision some scenarios in which maybe Australia would not be all in a Taiwan Strait crisis. But I'm convinced that because of Japanese interests, I have just no doubt that they would be. So we have probably more interoperability and more planning, and you know this better than I do, with Australia than we do with Japan. We need to accelerate with these areas of cooperation with Japan, but I ultimately think that their interests require them to be involved if there's a crisis there.
Just briefly, I said best. I agree with you. Japan is our most important ally. So as usual, we're agreeing, Bonnie.
Okay.
Thank you, Bonnie and Bridge. Veerle, do you have anything to add on either of the two questions?
Sure. Yeah. Just very quickly on the Japan point. I mean, this is, what I raised in my opening comment as well, was how does Japan feature into a Chinese calculation on Taiwan? And I think that is something that that needs to be explored further for sure, given the importance that Taiwan obviously has within Japanese strategic thinking, and increasingly publicly so. I think, on the 2 points in terms of AUKUS, I mean, obviously, the intent was not to offend France, and so some, the United States has said that the way that it was communicated and when it came out at the same time or a day earlier before the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, obviously that could have been handled better. But ultimately, this is a framework between 3 countries that have very close cooperation in military terms, where there is an opportunity to further that, and where I think the regional kind of threat perception is more aligned, and it doesn't exclude further cooperation for other countries to join in future as well. So, a former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo has already said that there might be an interesting role for Japan to play in some of the defense technology aspects of the relationship. So, I think we shouldn't necessarily see this as just a trilateral exclusive pact that doesn't include anyone else. And furthermore, I would be cautious to think that AUKUS necessarily has just completely torpedoed any, UK, European cooperation, or indeed US-French cooperation or otherwise. So obviously it's hit some sensitivities, but I don't think that it will necessarily be the end of the world as such in terms of cooperation amongst transatlantic allies in Australia. Just on the part of transatlantic positions vis-a-vis kind of normative aspects, I mean, we've mentioned the inclusion of or the role of China in the United Nations in promoting its standards. I would also just add to say that there's a lot to be done on the kind of normative bridging between the 2 sides of the Atlantic. We don't necessarily see the same on a variety of normative issues. And the United States itself as well, and Europe promote their own positions within the UN too. So if we are to be seriously concerned and address China's activity within international organizations, that transatlantic approach needs to be in focus as well. And just finally, in terms of domestic pressures in China and how that impacts Chinese foreign policy, I think there's two perceptions. One, that if China is incredibly stressed internally or feels weak internally, then it is going to lash out and be more less risk averse. And then there's others who say that if China is incredibly confident, then likewise it's going to lash out and be less risk averse. And which one is it? Is China going to operate from a position of strength or weakness? I personally think that when it comes to a Taiwan scenario, so far we haven't necessarily seen China be willing to lower its risk aversion and to take greater risk. I think this year, for example, is a very important one with the 20th Party Congress coming up. But obviously there are internal pressures and internal goals as well that China needs to meet over the coming years. And I think, in terms of a domestic political perspective, that is very important. And I really wouldn't underestimate some of the frustrations they have internally in needing to meet those and the prioritization that will take as well.
Thank you, Veerle. Also, for again highlighting the importance of underlying assumptions that are often left not spelled out, but that underlie the debates that we have. Now we are almost at the finish line for today. It's almost time. I do want to give everybody a chance for a very brief 1 to 2 minutes concluding remarks, anything that's been left unsaid that you think is most important that you want to get out, or otherwise responding to the question, what is the best way for the US and its allies and partners to deal with the challenge posed by China and also to preserve the status quo in the Taiwan Strait? Bridge, do you want to start?
No, just thank you so much to GMF, to all of you for participating, and to those who are watching, and really hope we can continue this conversation in a spirit of frankness and clarity. So thank you.
Thank you. Bonnie?
Great. Well, I didn't weigh in on the China-Russia issue, so I will just say something very briefly that I think that this is a relationship that its trajectory is clear. There are very real common interests between Russia and China, and I think we have to stop talking about a marriage of convenience. There are differences between Moscow and Beijing. There's no doubt about that. But they have demonstrated the capability to compartmentalize those differences so that they don't spill over into other areas in their potential cooperation. I don't think that their coordination and cooperation have developed to the point where, China is going to coordinate with Russia on a simultaneous invasion of Taiwan when Russia invades Ukraine. I just really don't think that's where the relationship is today. I don't rule out that it could get there, but I think that we do have to think through more seriously what those two countries are likely to do together. I think those who have advocated trying to drive a wedge between them, I think that ship has sailed. I don't think it's possible to achieve that. And the very last thing I'll say for those who are interested in Taiwan, the 20th Party Congress at the end of this year apparently is going to be a moment where Xi Jinping is going to articulate his strategy toward Taiwan. The phrase that has been rolled out now, it was actually first used in the 6th plenum in November of last year at the third historical resolution of the party. And so this is now being developed. There was a Taiwan work conference that talked about it. A member of the standing committee of the Politburo, Wang Yang, talked about it. So not a lot has come out yet, but the question is, what is that new strategy going to be? And is it going to continue to rely on what we call sort of the soft hand in combination with the hard hand, with each one maybe getting a little bit stronger? Or will it be far more significantly more coercive than we have seen? And I'm afraid people are really quite concerned about the potential for the latter. I think it's a little premature to predict, but watch this space.
Thank you, Bonnie. Certainly a lot to watch this year. Veerle, you have the last very short word.
Look, I just want to say thanks because I know we've hit our time. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Just in terms of the China-Russia relationship, I've actually just got an article that came out on that. So it does actually talk about the limits of the bilateral partnership, but certainly there is room for growth and a trajectory of cooperation. I just have question marks as to how far that's actually going to go. But in any case, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
With that, we are done for this session. Thank you very much to our audience for joining us today. And thank you, of course, to our three fantastic panelists for this interesting discussion, which I'm sure we'll have a chance to continue later this year as things develop. But thanks again to everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. See you next time.